Hello and welcome. I hope that you're all doing well. In this video, I'm going to introduce to you the concepts of relational and non-relational databases, which are basically just different ways or methods of storing data for an application. So you'll see that there's two major types here that we're going to talk about, and one of them relates to MySQL, which is relational, and then MongoDB is non-relational. So we'll discuss what each of those mean in this video. So starting off with relational databases. Relational databases are going to store data in an object known as a table. A table has rows and columns, much like a traditional table would have for storing data. And the general idea of these rows and columns is that each row represents a single data point, and then each column is a descriptor of that data point. So for example, suppose that you had a database that was storing students in it. Each row would be a single student, and then each column would describe things about that single student. For instance, it could have their name, could have a course that they're enrolled in, could have information related to this, right? So each of the columns represents information about that specific entity, and then the row is a single entity on its own. So that's the general idea of how relational databases work. Now, there's a lot of principles that relational databases are going to follow, but for the context of just introducing you to the idea of databases, the main things that you want to keep in mind is that every single table is going to store a single set of data. So for instance, you could have a table for students, maybe you have a table for courses, and then maybe they're related to each other in the sense that a student could be enrolled in courses. These relationships can be dictated through things called key relationships. And the general idea of this is that every single student is going to have a specific code maybe associated with them that uniquely identifies them. And then we can use that to link them into the courses table. So you can sort of relate those two tables together to say that the student has many courses that they're enrolled in, for instance. And we're going to take a look at that in a lot more detail as we continue to progress through this. But that would be the general idea, is that every table stores data, and then every row is a single entry. Every column is going to be a specific descriptor of that particular row. And then we can relate tables together, typically by some sort of unique identifier. Those are the main sort of high-level ideas of relational databases that we need to know before we start to dive into the concepts of how we work with them. Now, non-relational databases work a little bit differently. Rather than storing data in tables, we store data in objects. These objects can be really anything, whatever really fits the purpose of our application. So there's a lot of various different types that exist. There's document data stores, there's key value stores, and there's graph databases. Those are some of the most common ones. There's, of course, a lot more that exist. The general idea is that we can pick and choose whatever object works best for representing our data. So for example, a key value store has a key, which is an identifier, and then a value associated with it. We actually saw this idea when we took a look at storing data in Node. Our Node persist had an ID, which was a key, and then a value associated with it. That's a key value store. So that'd be an example of a non-relational database. These databases are non-relational because the data isn't separated in a way that everything relates to each other. An object could store more than one piece of data. It could store like a lot of different related pieces of data. So the relationships aren't necessarily required for these sorts of information. Now, at this point, I'll just discuss the fact that there do exist databases that combine these two together. There's things such as object relational databases, for example, that are able to combine these two types of databases together. And that is used by a database called Postgres, which is another common type of database that exists. For the purposes of these videos, we're really just going to focus on relational and non-relational databases, and I'm going to give you more of a high-level discussion of these databases. So I'm going to show you how to use SQL, which is the standard query, or structured query language rather, that is used to interact with the relational databases. Then we'll discuss how we can work with non-relational databases, and basically by the end of this, you'll have a good understanding of how to basically work with each of these. Then you could dive into a bit more detail of the theory of what each of these databases are like, but this will give you a general understanding. So thank you for watching this video. In the next video, we're going to dive into MySQL, which is a relational database technology, and we're going to see how we can use that in order to create tables and data and work with that data and see how we can, generally manipulate the data and work with it in MySQL.